Imagine believing the story was finished, that justice had been served, and then in a single trembling confession, everything collapses. The case of Yu Menglong, once thought to be solved, has just been turned upside down. What you're about to hear isn't just another twist. It's a revelation that rewrites the entire tragedy. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and restless tension, had fallen into a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the air itself. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the woman who had, for days, been known as the mastermind behind Yu Menglong's untimely death. She sat with her hands trembling, her voice faltering, and yet when she finally spoke, her words cut through the silence like a blade. What came out was not a confirmation of guilt, nor a plea for mercy, but a confession that shattered the foundation of everything the world thought it knew. For months, the narrative had been simple. Envy had fueled her, bitterness had consumed her, and with cruel precision, she had orchestrated the end of a rising star. But with one revelation, that entire story dissolved into dust. She declared she was not the architect of this crime. She had not drawn the blueprint of betrayal. Instead, she had been cast in a role written by another, manipulated into becoming the villain in a script she never authored. Her confession was chilling, not because it absolved her of wrongdoing, she admitted freely to her participation, but because it revealed a hidden hand, a shadow that had remained unseen until now. This man, she explained, was not a faceless phantom, but someone who had once walked in Yu Menglong's world, a colleague from years past who had vanished from the industry, his career extinguished, his dreams curdled into resentment. He had not forgotten, and he had not forgiven. From the shadows he had been plotting, waiting, and when the moment came, he found in her both a weakness and an opportunity. The way she described his methods was as horrifying as it was meticulous. He had studied Yu Menglong with an obsessive detail that most would mistake for admiration. He knew his routines, his friendships, his vulnerabilities, and even the fragile insecurities of those closest to him. With this knowledge, he constructed a plan that was less an act of violence and more a grotesque performance. Every word, every gesture, every lie she was to tell had been scripted. She had not confessed out of guilt when the investigation cornered her. She had confessed exactly as he had trained her to, playing her part in his theater of cruelty. Even the motive of jealousy, which had initially seemed so believable, was not her own but an illusion he had fed her, an emotion rehearsed until it could be performed convincingly. She admitted, with shame and trembling honesty, that she had agreed because the money he offered was overwhelming, life-changing, irresistible, and so she sold her conscience for a promise that the truth would never see daylight. But the truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface. Her voice shook as she recalled how he rehearsed every stage with her. He dictated which items should be moved to distort the scene, what lights should remain on, what words she should whisper to lure others into the trap. The use of sedatives, the staging of the accident, the manipulation of Yu's childhood friends. None of these had been her ideas. She had only directed them because she had been told to, her strings pulled by someone who had perfected the art of control. I was told to mislead, to take the fall, to carry the mask of envy, she confessed, her eyes wet with the weight of her guilt. But the mask was never mine. It belonged to him. The reaction in the courtroom was visceral. Judges leaned forward in disbelief. Prosecutors whispered frantically. And even Yu Menglong's childhood friends, who had already admitted their part in the crime, sat frozen in shock. One of them, his lips quivering, muttered words barely audible, so it wasn't even her. For the first time, the pieces began to shift, and what had once been a clear picture became something far more sinister. They had thought themselves accomplices to her envy, but now they realized they had been pawns too, drawn into the same web of deceit, their loyalty exploited, their insecurities weaponized. Their lawyers immediately signaled their intention to revise earlier statements, to expose how often she had referred to someone else, someone they dismissed as a deflection, but who had in truth been the puppeteer all along. The revelation spread like wildfire. Within hours, headlines blared across the globe. The female mastermind was not a mastermind at all, but a decoy, a smokescreen hiding the man who had orchestrated the tragedy from the shadows. Public anger, already simmering over what many saw as a lenient sentence for her and her accomplices, now erupted into fury. Streets filled with protesters carrying photographs of Yu Menglong, their voices rising as one in demand for justice. Social media exploded, not just with outrage, but with grief, as fans shared memories of the actor whose career had been so cruelly cut short. For them, this was not just about a crime. It was about betrayal, about the ugliness that envy and bitterness could breed, and about the feeling that truth had been stolen alongside a life. Authorities acted quickly. An international warrant was issued for the man she had named, his identity unmasked at last. Investigators confirmed what many had feared. Financial records showed large transfers of money to her accounts, routed through shell companies linked to him. It was proof, solid and undeniable, that her words were more than a desperate attempt to save herself. It was evidence that the true architect of the crime was still at large, and the world demanded his capture. For every fan who had mourned, for every citizen who had believed the story ended with envy, this was vindication, but also a wound reopened. The most heart-wrenching response came from Yu Menglong's family. After weeks of silence, his father stepped forward, his voice trembling but unwavering. "Our son's death cannot be explained by envy alone," he declared. "If another hand was behind this, then justice has not yet been served. We demand the full truth. We demand that the one truly responsible face the consequences." His words struck deep, resonating not only with those who loved Yu, but with an entire nation that had adopted his story as their own. The case was no longer just about a young man's life cut short. It had become a symbol of the fight for truth, for justice, and for the courage to look beyond appearances. And yet, even as outrage burned and investigators pursued the man who had hidden in the shadows for so long, there was something haunting in her testimony. It forced everyone to confront the fragility of truth itself, how easily a story could be manipulated, how convincingly a lie could be rehearsed, how deeply deception could take root when fueled by greed and resentment. Her confession was not only a revelation about a crime, it was a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous battles are not fought with weapons, but with words, performances, and carefully constructed illusions. The story of Yu Menglong's case has become more than a tragedy. It has become a mirror. It reflects the darkness of envy, the destructiveness of betrayal, but also the resilience of those who demand that justice prevail. It reminds us that truth, though buried, has a way of rising again, carried on trembling voices, relentless protests, and the determination of those who refuse to let shadows win. And as the search for the real mastermind continues, the world is left with both grief and resolve. Grief for the life stolen too soon, and resolve to ensure that the story does not end in lies, but in justice finally served.